expanding economic activity. So we're actually going to be at 550. We're going to be at 450 in about 10 years. 430 now, adding 2.5 a year. 10 years or so, we'll be at 450. So stabilising at 450 would be very hard to do, and we've almost missed that boat. And remember, 450 would give you a 50-50 probability of being above or below 2 degrees, which many people have argued is already quite a dangerous temperature increase. So we have to be realistic about what can be done. On the other hand, you could stabilise, although 450 stabilisation would be tough, it's just about possible. 550 would be much less tough, and we argue that the costs of stabilising around 550, and I'll come to how you do that in just a moment, would be around 1% of national income. With uncertainty, we don't know for sure. Depends how good policy is, depends how lucky we are with technical progress and so on. So we have a range of around 1% of the cost of stabilising around 550. So what's involved in stabilisation? Well, the upper path here is business as usual, which goes steaming off to much higher emissions. And if we did that, we would be in the region of 850 parts per million in the atmosphere by the end of the century. And that would be an extremely dangerous place to be. We'd be more likely than not above 5 degrees centigrade in the early part of, or sometime in the first half of the next century. It's very hard to think that that could be a sensible strategy in anybody's book. 550, as I've said, is not a safe place to be, but it's far, far less risky than business as usual. You can remove a lot of the big risks associated with business as usual if you stabilise at 550. So what we argue essentially, in this rather informal way, but looking in a disaggregated story at the impacts on different parts of the world associated with these different stabilisation levels, we argue that a natural place for the target, a sensible place for the target stabilisation level, is somewhere between 450 and 550 parts per million. It no doubt will be argued very strongly and enthusiastically. Some people will say 550 is too tough and too costly. Others will say that 550 is too dangerous. People will argue for 500. Some will still argue for 450. But somewhere in that range of 450 to 550, we suggest is a sensible place to be. And I've given the costs of getting there. Lots of people have estimated those costs with different kind of economic models. We did our own sort of technology, resource-based cost, saying, what if you invested in these technologies, got them out there for power and transport and so on, and deforestation and energy efficiency. And we built up our own cost story, which was also about 1% of GDP average over time. A little bit lower at the beginning, a little bit higher at some point, a little bit lower later on. A lot of uncertainty, but that's roughly the ballpark. Because it's around that level, which is just like the price level being a bit more expensive, the price level being a bit higher, we argue that this essentially is a manageable story which wouldn't stop growth. You just pay a bit more to do things a bit differently. So that's the story of stabilisation and what it might cost. What might it save? Well, that's a difficult thing to judge. You have to try to estimate or get some feel for the kinds of risks involved for the very high temperatures that could be the result of business as usual. I've actually described the story to you in a way which we develop in a rather disaggregated way, looking at different places. We described that in the review, and that actually is the kind of argument I find the most convincing. Economics likes aggregate numbers, or economists like aggregate numbers, and we've offered, using some of the basic economic models, some of the kinds of numbers which could give you, which would be the risks involved in business as usual. And that's where we get the 5% to the 20% of GDP that you may have read about as the damage associated with business as usual. And that's an averaging. The averaging process is a little bit complicated. I won't go into detail, but it's averaged over time. It'll be less than that initially, possibly more than that later, and it's averaged over possible outcomes. Some outcomes will